Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now, as always, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the wonderful people at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. It's a membership group. You can be a member. Membership is just $50 Australian. I'm a member and I strongly recommend you think about joining. ASA can only do its wonderful work if it has members because it relies on the subs it gets from its members. So please think about joining the organisation. Have a look at them on Facebook, and you can also go to their website by putting Australasian Animal Studies Association or ASA into Google. Now, this episode of Knowing Animals, as with the preceding few, are coming to you from the ASA conference, the 2017 ASA conference being held at the University of Adelaide. And I'm here with one of the speakers at the conference. I'm joined by Associate Professor Philip Armstrong. Now, Philip is based at the Department of English at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. Philip is co-director of the New Zealand Centre for Human Animal Studies, and today we're going to be discussing Philip's latest book, which is called Sheep, and it's part of the Animal series, which has been edited by Jonathan Bart, and which is published by Reaktion Books, that's right, and it came out in 2016. So welcome to the podcast, Philip.
Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you for having me.
So, Philip, can you start by telling us what led you to write this book?
Well, I'd been an admirer of the Reaktion Animal series, so it was the series itself that kind of inspired me, I suppose, and I really like the idea of focusing on a particular animal and kind of following through the cultural and the natural history of a particular species. And my partner Annie Potts had recently written sheep. I wrote sheep. She had recently written chicken for the series, and I was really impressed by that. And so I thought I might be able to have a go. Also, in the past, when I'd focused on particular species, I'd done some work on whales, for example, and dolphins. And I like the idea of focusing on an animal perceived as much more humdrum and perhaps perceived as, the most humdrum of mammal species. And as a New Zealander, sheep seemed something that I needed to think about too.
Yes, so Philip, you open the book with the observation that you hadn't actually really met a sheep. I don't think you had any sheep friends.
No.
Yet, as a Kiwi, of course, that's where our terribly bigoted minds in Australia go to.
Yeah.
So what does this mean for the sheep? They're kind of all around, yet we don't have any friends that are sheep.
Yeah. I think you've put your finger on what I was trying to get at by starting the book in that way. That sheep, when I was growing up, was sort of ubiquitous. I wore sheep products, I ate sheep meat, and they were everywhere in the national psyche, but I had nothing to do with them. So they were both intensely familiar and completely invisible. And I mean, we'd go for drives in the country and the hills would be full of sheep, but I didn't even think about them as animals. They were just sort of part of the landscape. And to me, that's a really important job that research and writing and actually creative activity has to do, which is to defamiliarize the familiar, to look at the things that are so familiar that we take them for granted, and we don't think about our relationships with them, yet they're the things that we're most dependent on. And then once you start to do that, once you look at them and start to find out all the things that you don't know because they're so familiar, really surprising things emerge.
So one of the other observations you make is that sheep tend to be thought of as a mass animal, and that then has implications for us because we're much better, or certainly more perhaps in my view, empathetic towards the individual.
Yeah.
Did you get to befriend any individuals or get to know any individuals?
Only after writing the book, as it happened, because we have a friend who does a lot of work with rehoming animals from stray animals from the pound, and sometimes sheep turn up in the pound in New Zealand, and this particular sheep did, and we would love to have rehomed him, but we don't have space, and also sheep are gregarious, and so you don't want to. A sheep doesn't want to live just by him or herself. So we rehomed him to Annie's sister's place. She has a variety of animals, and there are sheep nearby, and also she has alpacas and a horse. And he's and so I've got to know him. Moby, we call him, the great white sheep, because he's a big lad, and he's made very close friendships with the alpacas. They seem to recognise each other as sort of wool-bearing animals from distant parts of the world, and also with the horse. And also, he's got a friend in the next-door paddock, and he busts through the fence periodically to go and see his mate, and then he busts back in again. And he's a very strong personality indeed, and I have the bruises to show for it.
Oh, good on you, Moby. Wonderful. Yeah. So you've just described, quite a bit about somebody's character. But one of the things that you write about in your book, and which I also was lucky enough to hear you speak yesterday, which you talked about in your presentation, is this idea that sheep tend to be thought of as stupid. Is that fair? Where does that come from, and what does it mean for them?
It's a really old idea. Even Aristotle talks about the stupidity of sheep. But then in the next sentence, he says, but actually shepherds can train sheep to come at the clap of their hands. And so he associates, so he says that they're stupid, but then on the other hand, he says they can be trained in the same way that dogs can be trained, and dogs we tend to think of as among the more intelligent animals. So there's always been this idea, at least in Western cultures, but it's always been a somewhat contradictory idea. And I think the biblical tradition has also contributed to it. Sheep are not regarded as stupid in the Bible, but they're regarded as passive, as giving themselves up for sacrifice, and Jesus in the New Testament is referred to as the Lamb of God, for slaughter, passively giving himself up for our sins and so on. And so I think that idea, that religious idea of sheep passivity or their patience or self-surrender, has connected up often with the idea of stupidity, and particularly now in a sort of post-religious societies like Australia and New Zealand, the idea of sheep as, too stupid even to look after their own interests is a really strong one. And I think there are material reasons why that's such a strong idea. Some of the things that I discovered in researching the book include the way in which, as a very, very social animal, a very gregarious animal, fundamentally a flock animal, to develop emotionally and to develop spatial intelligence and interpersonal intelligence, sheep need to develop within a flock. They need to develop their relationship with first with the ewe, with their mother who nurses them, and then with other members of the flock who become they develop a series of sort of constellated relationships, which are quite complex, through that maternal relationship. And they form, in nature, particular bonds, which can be lifelong, between members of the same sex. And all of those things play a part in quite a complex set of relationships that form the flock. The way that we farm them, though, and the way that sheep have been farmed for hundreds of years, ever since the enclosures of the late Middle Ages, is in flocks of thousands, tens of thousands often. And that's very disorienting for an animal whose flock size in nature isn't anything like as big as that. But also, of course, we disrupt their relationships in all sorts of ways. We take away the young lambs for slaughter if they're being raised, for Christmas lamb or whatever. We take them away at a few months of age. The mothers don't get to live very long, even if they're wool-bearing animals. They don't tend to get to live very long, and so those lifelong relationships that really constitute the social intelligence of the whole flock are constantly disrupted. So we make sheep, I think, possibly psychotic isn't too strong a word, that their whole way of developing social intelligence and emotional intelligence and spatial intelligence is being constantly disrupted. So there are kind of traditions for seeing sheep as stupid, but there are also ways in which we make them, we make it impossible for them to be as smart as they would be in nature.
Fascinating. So, Philip, you write that sheep are central, or were central, or have been central to the establishment of capitalism, colonialism, and industrialisation. How have sheep played that role in our human cultural evolution?
Well, in the ancient world, in the Mesopotamia, that's sometimes called the cradle of civilization, sheep and goats were the first animals domesticated for agricultural purposes, and so wool and milk predominantly were what they were farmed for. And the farming of sheep and the use for milk and wool were amongst the things that led to the development of cities and settlement rather than nomadic populations, led to the development of writing and accounting and mathematics and all sorts of things like that. So they're very much part of the story of what we like to think of as human civilization. But then, certainly for those of us who live in places like Australia and New Zealand or the United States or Canada, places that have emerged out of European imperialism, and particularly British imperialism, we've inherited an economics and a modes of production that were really shaped in quite fundamental ways by sheep farming and by the production of textiles and wool, which were really central to the British economy and society from the Middle Ages onwards. And during the Renaissance in particular, there was increasing competition between Britain and some of its rival nations, particularly Spain, for the production of very fine fleece. And the Spanish had a sheep called the Merino, and eventually the British got hold of the Merino breed, and those were the sheep that were first, driven in huge numbers into New South Wales and then other parts of Australia in the early 19th century, and then in the mid 19th century across to New Zealand. So colonialism in the form that has really affected this part of the world most strongly has been fundamentally kind of pastoral, tied up with pastoralism.
And so has the work been reasonably thankless on the part of the sheep?
Thankless on the part of the sheep. That's a really good question. I think it has. It's at first glance, if you're a pure evolutionist, then you would say, well, no, it's been the sheep as a species has been richly rewarded because look how many of them there are, and they're in no danger of dying out, and they're reproducing more and more and more. But if we think about the actual experience of sheep on those farms, as I said earlier, they're in a constant state of disorientation and often a constant state of anxiety and distress because of the way that these huge flocks are constituted, because of practices like very painful and distress-causing practices like mulesing or tail docking, which are often carried out without anaesthetic. And then, of course, there's the whole question of slaughter shearing itself, which is very distressing for the animals, and then a big topic of live transport, which is still a very big issue here in Australia, I know. So in all these ways, it looks as, you look at a field of sheep and they look as if they're living some kind of idyllic existence. But there are all sorts of practices that we would associate with industrial agriculture, and with the kind of animal suffering that we know is integrally part of the industrial animal system, that actually do apply to sheep, even though it doesn't look like it when you see them in the green fields.
Now, Philip, your book is very beautiful and it contains a lot of images. Why were images an important part of the story for you?
It was. Your original question was about inspiration for the book, and that is another answer, is that those reaction books are beautiful. They're beautifully done, and they all have lots of images, lots of which are in colour. And so, I really wanted to write a book in which the story was told partly through images and partly about images, because I suppose writing is... we all face this when we write about animals, that writing's a very un-animal-like thing to do in some ways. It's very abstract, and it's a very, the kind of writing that we're talking about anyway is very sort of human-like. And so I think any writer who wants to write about animals struggles to express or convey the sort of bodily and physical and multi-sensory aspects of animal life. And so visual images give us at least another sense to work with. And because there's a big emphasis in those reaction books on art, artists are very good at using visual imagery to elicit multisensory and multidimensional kind of aspects of existence. So, I mean, a good example of that is that I finished the book with some images from Henry Moore. And Henry Moore, although we associate him with abstraction, was trying to use, I suppose one of the things he was trying to do was to use abstraction as a way of thinking about bodies and thinking about space and bodies' occupation of space. And he was particularly interested in sheep. And he was, did a lot of sketches of sheep, and those are the ones that I use. And he also did sculptures about sheep and about sheep in space. And he said that for him, what he noticed was that initially when he looked at the sheep, he saw them as just these amorphous, woolly, cloud-like things. But the more time he spent looking at them, the more he noticed the particular contours of their bodies and the movements of their bodies and the way they related to each other, the lambs to the ewes and the ewes to the rams and so on. And so he became more and more fascinated by them as really good examples of this multi-sensory bodily inhabitation of space, and that's what he tries to convey in his sketches and his sculpture. So, a few Henry Moore pictures can say a hell of a lot more than I can say in thousands and thousands of words, that's for sure.
Wonderful. Well, Philip, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions.
Oh.
Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yeah, I'll have to be.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
No.
Can you remember an early piece that you read?
Yes, I can actually. No, and this is the answer to the first question as well. John Berger, Why Look at Animals?
Oh,
yeah,
nice.
Which is still really important text for me. Yeah.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes. Do you want me to tell you what that was?
Yes, I do.
So that was a thing called The Post-Colonial Animal. And it was for the 10-year anniversary of Society and Animals Journal, and they wanted very short pieces, like 1,000 or 1,500 words on different disciplinary approaches, and mine was to do with post-colonial studies.
Wonderful. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I would say... I would say, John Berger isn't really an animal studies scholar, but that single article did have a very big impact on me. but I would also say, I actually think, and again, this is not necessarily an animal studies scholar, Bruno Latour has had quite a big impact on what I do. Yeah.
Okay. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Teach, I think. I mean, research and writing, those are really, really important things. And for the people who read research and for our development of the discipline, I think research is really important to do. And it's important too, I suppose the second thing I would say is to try and present our research to as wide an audience as possible, which is a kind of teaching. But for me, in my experience, it's actually what happens in the classroom that has the most impact. Yeah.
So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Factory farms. Get rid of those straight away. That seems to me the easiest, most obvious thing that everybody can agree on, and that would make the most difference to the most animals and to the environment as well.
So Philip, what are you working on next?
I'm working on a book about nature more broadly. It's got about 3 chapters on animals and about 3 chapters on non-animal nature, on trees and earthquakes and oceans. But the chapter I'm particularly working on is one, I'm not sure what the title is, but it's about, I'm thinking of it as being about summonings and visitations. So moments, particularly in literature, where people summon animals or call on animals for particular reasons and what happens. And then visitations is when people suddenly encounter animals or are visited by animals when they don't expect it.
Fascinating.
That's all I can say about it at the moment. It's just a sort of hunch.
So where can people find out more about your work?
They could go to the New Zealand Centre for Human Animal Studies website, NZCHAS we call it, so just nzchas.canterbury, which is the university that hosts it, .ac.nz.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Philip, for joining us for Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can also like us at Facebook at Knowing Animals. Don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.